In the heart of Manhattan's financial district, where glass towers pierce the clouds and fortunes are made with a single signature, there are men who believe their wealth makes them untouchable. Marcus Vanderbilt was one of them. CEO of Vanderbilt Capital Management, he ruled his empire with an iron fist and a sharp tongue, crushing anyone he deemed beneath him. But sometimes, the people we underestimate hold the power to change everything. This is the story of how one quiet intern brought a titan to his knees, not with violence, but with a truth that had been hidden for 30 years. Call to action, 15 seconds. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We love hearing from our global audience. And if you enjoy stories with unexpected twists, hit that subscribe button right now, so you never miss our next incredible tale. Now, let's dive into Marcus Vanderbilt's world. Main story begins. The morning sun reflected off the steel and glass facade of Vanderbilt Tower, casting geometric shadows across Fifth Avenue. Inside the 47th floor executive suite, Marcus Vanderbilt stood before floor-to-ceiling windows, surveying the city below like a modern-day emperor. At 52, he was the picture of corporate success. Silver hair meticulously styled, a $15,000 Tom Ford suit draped perfectly over his broad shoulders, and a Patek Philippe watch that cost more than most people's homes glinting on his wrist. Marcus had built Vanderbilt Capital from the ground up after inheriting a modest trust fund from his father 30 years ago. Through ruthless business tactics, strategic acquisitions, and an uncanny ability to read market trends, he had transformed that initial million into a billion-dollar empire. He managed portfolios for celebrities, tech moguls, and old money families who trusted him to multiply their wealth. But success had come at a price Marcus never acknowledged: his humanity. His assistant, Jennifer, a sharp woman in her early 30s who had learned to navigate Marcus's volatile moods, knocked softly before entering. "Mr. Vanderbilt, the new interns are here for orientation. You asked to address them personally." Marcus turned from the window, a predatory smile crossing his face. "Ah, yes. Time to separate the wheat from the chaff. Send them to the main conference room. I'll be there in 5 minutes." Jennifer hesitated. "Sir, Human Resources mentioned we should try to be more welcoming this year. We lost 3 interns last quarter due to their own weakness." Marcus interrupted, his voice cold as January wind. "If they can't handle pressure here, they'll crumble in the real world. I'm doing them a favor, Jennifer. Now, is there anything else?" She pressed her lips together and shook her head, retreating from his office. Marcus straightened his tie, checked his reflection in the glass, and headed to the conference room with the confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions. The conference room on the 45th floor was designed to intimidate. A massive mahogany table stretched nearly 20 feet, surrounded by leather chairs that cost more than a semester of college tuition. The walls displayed abstract art from galleries in Chelsea, each piece worth 6 figures. 8 young interns sat nervously around the table, their cheap suits and anxious expressions marking them as fresh out of business school, desperate to prove themselves in the cutthroat world of high finance. Marcus entered without knocking, and the room fell silent. He didn't sit. Instead, he walked slowly around the table, hands clasped behind his back, examining each intern like a general inspecting troops. "Welcome to Vanderbilt Capital," he began, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "I'm going to be honest with you because I believe in honesty. Most of you won't make it past the first month. You'll wash out, run home crying to your parents about how hard the real world is, and end up managing a regional bank in whatever small town you crawled out of." He paused behind a young woman with red hair who was frantically taking notes. "You don't need to write this down, sweetheart. You either have what it takes, or you don't. No amount of note-taking will change that." Her face flushed crimson, and she set down her pen with trembling hands. Marcus continued his circuit, stopping behind a nervous young man adjusting his glasses. "Finance isn't about being nice. It's about being smart, ruthless, and reading people better than they read themselves. If you're here to make friends, you're in the wrong building. There's a Starbucks downstairs where you can have all the friendship you want." A few interns chuckled nervously, unsure if they should laugh or remain silent. Then Marcus reached the end of the table, where a young man sat almost motionless, his eyes downcast. He appeared to be in his early 20s, with dark hair that fell slightly over his forehead, pale skin that suggested he didn't spend much time outdoors, and a suit that was clean but clearly purchased from a department store clearance rack. Unlike the others who fidgeted or avoided Marcus's gaze, this young man simply sat still, his hands folded neatly on the table in front of him. "And who do we have here?" Marcus asked, leaning close enough that the intern could smell his expensive cologne. "What's your name?" The young man looked up slowly, revealing brown eyes that held an unusual depth. "Daniel, sir. Daniel Reed." His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, and Marcus's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Daniel Reed. Let me guess. State school? Scholarship student? First person in your family to wear a suit that wasn't rented for a wedding?" Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't respond. The other interns shifted uncomfortably in their seats, grateful they weren't the target of Marcus's attention. "I asked you a question, Daniel," Marcus pressed, his voice hardening. "When I ask a question in my company, I expect an immediate answer. Or are you too shy to speak up?" "State University, sir," Daniel replied, his voice still quiet but steady. "Full scholarship. And yes, I'm the first in my family to work in finance." Marcus laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "How inspiring. Let me give you some free advice, Daniel Reed. This industry chews up and spits out people like you every single day. You might have been the smartest kid in your community college prep courses, but here, you're competing with Ivy League graduates who have connections you can't even imagine. You're already behind, and that timid little voice of yours isn't going to cut it when you're trying to close a deal with a client who has 50 other firms calling them." Daniel said nothing, his expression unreadable. Marcus interpreted the silence as defeat and moved on, addressing the group as a whole. "You'll be assigned to various departments over the next 3 months. Show me something impressive, and you might get a job offer. Disappoint me, and you'll be gone before you can update your LinkedIn profile. Questions?" No one dared to speak. "Good. Jennifer will give you your assignments. Welcome to Vanderbilt Capital. Try not to embarrass yourselves." Marcus strode out of the conference room, already dismissing the interns from his mind. He had a lunch meeting with a potential client worth $200 million, and that required his full attention. Daniel Reed and his shy demeanor were already forgotten. Over the following weeks, the interns scattered throughout the company like seeds in the wind, and as Marcus had predicted, several of them wilted quickly under the pressure. The red-haired woman quit after 2 weeks when a senior analyst made her cry during a presentation. Another intern was fired for making a minor error on a spreadsheet that cost the company nothing, but which Marcus used as an example of unacceptable incompetence. Daniel Reed was assigned to the research department, a windowless floor filled with analysts who spent their days poring over financial reports, market trends, and economic indicators. It was considered the least glamorous position, where interns did grunt work, compiling data, fact-checking reports, and preparing presentations for senior staff who rarely acknowledged their contributions. Marcus rarely visited the research floor. It was beneath him, full of number crunchers and introverts who lacked the charisma for client-facing roles. But occasionally, when he needed specific data for a presentation, he would sweep through like a storm, demanding immediate answers and berating anyone who couldn't provide them fast enough. On a cold Tuesday morning in late October, Marcus found himself on the research floor, irritated that his senior analyst hadn't responded to his email within the 15 minutes he deemed acceptable. The floor was quiet except for the soft clicking of keyboards and the hum of computers. Rows of cubicles stretched toward the back wall, each occupied by someone staring intently at multiple monitors. "Where's Patterson?" Marcus barked at the first analyst he saw, a middle-aged man with thinning hair who jumped at the sound of his voice. "He's in a meeting, sir. Can I help you with?" "I need the Henderson portfolio analysis, and I need it now. I have a meeting in 40 minutes. The analyst's face paled. "I believe Daniel was working on that project. Let me get him for you." "Daniel?" Marcus frowned, the name only vaguely familiar. Then he remembered, the shy intern from orientation. "The scholarship kid? You're telling me my presentation is dependent on an intern? He's been exceptional, sir. Very thorough, and I don't care if he's Einstein reincarnated. Get him here now." Moments later, Daniel appeared from behind a cubicle wall carrying a tablet and wearing the same inexpensive suit Marcus had mocked weeks earlier. His hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it while concentrating, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested long hours. "Mr. Vanderbilt," Daniel said quietly, "I have the Henderson analysis ready. Would you like me to send it to your email, or I want you to explain it to me right here, right now?" Marcus interrupted. "Convince me that my senior analyst was right to trust an intern with something this important." Daniel glanced at the other analysts, watching nervously from their cubicles, then nodded. He tapped the tablet screen and began speaking, his voice still quiet but clear and confident when discussing his work. "The Henderson portfolio is currently weighted heavily in tech stocks, which have performed well over the past 18 months. However, I noticed unusual trading patterns in 3 of their major holdings over the past 2 weeks. After cross-referencing with insider trading reports and upcoming earnings announcements, I believe 2 of those companies are going to miss their projections significantly. I've prepared alternative recommendations that would diversify their holdings into emerging markets and medical technology sectors, which show stronger fundamentals based on demographic trends and government healthcare spending increases. Marcus listened, his expression unreadable. The analysis was actually quite good, better than what some of his senior analysts would have provided. But admitting that would mean acknowledging an intern, and worse, the shy intern he had specifically mocked. Emerging markets? Marcus scoffed. That's a rookie suggestion. You clearly don't understand the volatility factors. Daniel met his gaze for the first time since that initial orientation. With respect, sir, I included a full volatility analysis on page 7 of the report, along with historical precedents from similar market conditions in 2019 and 2008. The risk is manageable if properly hedged, and the potential returns outweigh the current portfolio's trajectory, given the signals I identified. The other analysts had stopped even pretending to work, watching this exchange with barely concealed shock. No one talked back to Marcus Vanderbilt, especially not an intern. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. Send me the full report, and next time, have it ready before I have to come down here looking for it. This isn't college, Reed. In the real world, timing matters. It was sent to your email at 7 this morning, sir, Daniel replied quietly. 6 hours before your meeting. A tense silence filled the floor. Marcus's face flushed slightly, a rare crack in his composed exterior. He had been so busy responding to other emails and taking phone calls that he hadn't seen Daniel's report buried in his inbox. Rather than acknowledge this, Marcus simply turned and walked away, calling over his shoulder, "Then you should have sent it twice to make sure I saw it." As the elevator doors closed behind Marcus, the senior analyst who had introduced Daniel let out a low whistle. "That was either very brave or very stupid, kid." Daniel returned to his cubicle without responding, but his hands were shaking slightly as he sat down. Standing up to Marcus Vanderbilt felt like jumping off a cliff, exhilarating and terrifying simultaneously. The Henderson meeting went exceptionally well. The client was impressed with the depth of analysis and the forward-thinking recommendations, ultimately agreeing to restructure their entire portfolio along the lines Daniel had suggested. It was a $15 million reallocation, generating significant fees for Vanderbilt Capital. Marcus took full credit during the meeting, presenting the analysis as his own insight. But back at the office, in a rare moment of fairness that surprised even Jennifer, he sent an email to the research department head. "The Reed intern shows potential. Give him more substantial projects." It wasn't praise exactly, but in Marcus Vanderbilt's world, it was as close as anyone ever got. Over the next several weeks, Daniel became the department's secret weapon. He worked quietly, arriving early and staying late, often the last person on the research floor when security made their evening rounds. He didn't socialize with the other interns, didn't join them for happy hour on Fridays, and rarely spoke unless directly addressed. But his work was impeccable, thorough, insightful, and consistently ahead of schedule. Marcus began to notice Daniel's name appearing on more reports, always in small print at the bottom as a contributing analyst, but increasingly associated with the projects that went smoothly. It irritated him that an intern, especially that particular intern, was becoming indispensable. Marcus had built his empire on being the smartest person in every room, and the idea that some quiet kid from a state school might actually have genuine talent threatened the narrative he'd constructed about himself. During a senior staff meeting in mid-November, Marcus's chief operating officer, Richard Chen, brought up the quarterly intern review. "We need to make offers to the top performers before other firms poach them. I have 3 recommendations, but there's one candidate who's exceptional. Daniel Reed in research. Patterson says he's the best analyst he's seen in a decade." Marcus set down his coffee cup with slightly more force than necessary. "Reed is competent. I'll grant you that. But exceptional? He barely speaks above a whisper. Can you imagine him in a client meeting? We need people with presence, not mouse librarians." "With respect, Marcus," Richard replied, choosing his words carefully, "we need people who make us money." Reed's analysis on the Henderson portfolio alone generated more in fees than 3 of our junior analysts combined. His work on the Westfield merger last week identified regulatory issues our legal team missed. "The kid's brilliant." "Brilliant is a strong word," Marcus said dismissively. "He's detail-oriented, I'll give him that. But there's more to this business than crunching numbers in a back room. You need fire, aggression, the ability to command a room. Reed has none of that." Jennifer, sitting quietly in the corner taking notes, glanced up. "Mr. Vanderbilt, if I may, sometimes the best analysts aren't the loudest, and his communication in written reports is excellent. Not everyone needs to be a front man. Marcus shot her a look that could freeze water. When I want your opinion, Jennifer, I'll ask for it. As I recall, you're here to take notes, not offer strategic advice. The room fell silent. Richard cleared his throat. I'd still like to extend him a job offer. We can start him in research, see if he develops more confidence. If he doesn't work out, we can always— Fine, Marcus interrupted. But he's your responsibility, Richard. If he embarrasses this firm in any way, it reflects on your judgment. And the meeting moved on to other topics. But Marcus found himself distracted, annoyed that a 22-year-old intern was generating this much discussion. That evening, as he sat in his penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, nursing a glass of scotch that cost more than Daniel's monthly rent, Marcus made a decision. He would pay closer attention to Daniel Reed, not to mentor him, but to find his breaking point. Everyone had one, and Marcus had become an expert at identifying and exploiting weakness. If Daniel Reed was going to work at his firm, he needed to understand who was in charge. The following Monday, Marcus implemented what he called quality control measures, but what everyone else recognized as targeted harassment. He began appearing on the research floor unannounced, always when Daniel was in the middle of complex work, demanding immediate updates on projects. He critiqued Daniel's reports in company-wide emails, copying senior management and highlighting minor formatting inconsistencies while ignoring the substance of the analysis. He assigned Daniel to multiple projects with overlapping deadlines, then berated him when he asked for clarification on priorities. Figure it out, Reed, Marcus said during one particularly tense encounter. No one's going to hold your hand in this industry. You want to survive here? Learn to manage your time better and speak up when you're addressing me. That mumbling is unprofessional. Daniel endured it all with the same quiet resilience he'd shown since day one. He worked longer hours, double-checked everything, and never complained. The other analysts watched with a mixture of sympathy and relief that they weren't the targets. Some tried to offer support, sharing their own horror stories about Marcus's treatment, but Daniel just thanked them politely and returned to his work. But late at night, alone in his tiny studio apartment in Queens, Daniel sat at his second-hand desk and stared at a photograph he kept in his wallet. It showed a young woman with kind eyes and dark hair, wearing a faded dress and standing in front of a small house with peeling paint. On the back, written in elegant script, were the words, "For my son, be brave, love always, Mom." Daniel's mother, Catherine Reed, had died when he was 17. Cancer, aggressive and merciless, had taken her within 6 months of diagnosis. She had been a secretary at a law firm working long hours to support Daniel after his father abandoned them when Daniel was just a baby. She had sacrificed everything to ensure Daniel could attend college. Even taking out loans she knew she'd never live to repay. Before she died, Catherine had told Daniel something that had shaped his entire adult life. "Your father came from a world that didn't want me," she had said, her voice weak but clear. "He was young, wealthy, and scared. When I told him I was pregnant, he gave me money to take care of it and walked away. I kept you, Daniel, because you were the best thing that ever happened to me. Don't let his cowardice define you. Be better than he was. Be strong. Be kind, and never let cruelty make you cruel." Daniel had honored her memory by excelling in school, earning that full scholarship, and working harder than everyone around him. He had also made a private vow. He would find his father, not for money, not for revenge, but to look him in the eye and show him that the son he threw away had become someone worthwhile. It had taken years of patient research, saved money spent on background checks and careful investigation, but Daniel had finally found him, Marcus Henry Vanderbilt. The timeline matched perfectly. 30 years ago, Marcus had been a junior analyst at an investment firm, young and ambitious, dating casually while building his career. Catherine Reed had been a secretary in the same building, sweet and shy, who had fallen for Marcus's charm. When she became pregnant, Marcus had panicked. He was 22, focused on his career, and the idea of a child threatened everything he was building. He gave Catherine $5,000 and disappeared from her life completely, even changing his phone number. Marcus never knew Catherine kept the baby. He never knew about Daniel, and Daniel had never planned to tell him, content to observe from a distance, to understand what kind of man his father had become. But when he saw the intern posting for Vanderbilt Capital, something changed. Daniel wanted to see if Marcus would recognize himself in his son's face. He wanted to know if there was any decency left in the man who had abandoned them. What he found was a cruel, arrogant tyrant who mocked people for sport, and while it hurt more than Daniel had expected, It also clarified something. Marcus Vanderbilt deserved to know the truth, not as revenge, but as a reckoning. The opportunity came in early December during the company's annual investor gala. It was Vanderbilt Capital's most important event, held at the Plaza Hotel with 500 guests, including billionaire clients, board members, and financial journalists from every major publication. Marcus spared no expense. Ice sculptures, caviar stations, a 12-piece orchestra, and champagne that cost more per bottle than most people's weekly salary. Daniel wasn't initially invited. Interns rarely were. But Richard Chen, impressed by Daniel's work and disturbed by Marcus's treatment of him, personally added Daniel to the guest list. "You've earned it," Richard told him. "Take the evening to network. You've got a bright future." Daniel arrived at the plaza, wearing the same suit he'd worn to orientation, now professionally dry-cleaned but still obviously inexpensive compared to the designer tuxedos surrounding him. The ballroom was magnificent. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across marble floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of Central Park, dusted with early December snow. Marcus stood near the center of the room, surrounded by admirers, holding court like a king at his coronation. He wore a custom tuxedo and a smile that never quite reached his eyes, laughing at jokes from wealthy clients and posing for photographs with board members. He was in his element, the center of attention, untouchable. Daniel observed from the periphery, nursing a glass of champagne he hadn't touched, watching his father charm and manipulate everyone around him. Several times, Marcus's gaze swept across the room and passed right over Daniel without the slightest flicker of recognition. No resemblance noted, no connection felt. To Marcus, Daniel was just another forgettable face in a forgettable suit. Around 9 p.m., Marcus took the stage to give his annual address. The room quieted as he tapped the microphone, his commanding presence demanding attention. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Marcus began, his voice smooth and confident. 30 years ago, I started Vanderbilt Capital with nothing but ambition and a small trust fund. Through hard work, smart decisions, and surrounding myself with the best people, we've built something extraordinary. This year, we managed over $3 billion in assets, generated returns that exceeded market averages by 14%, and solidified our reputation as the premier wealth management firm on the East Coast. Applause filled the room. Marcus paused, soaking it in. "I've always believed that success comes to those who are willing to do whatever it takes, who are tough enough to make hard decisions, smart enough to see opportunities others miss, and strong enough to eliminate weakness from their lives. That philosophy has guided every decision I've made, personal and professional, and I stand here tonight as proof that it works." More applause. Marcus was building to his closing remarks when a quiet voice from the audience interrupted. "Even when that meant abandoning your own son?" The room fell silent. Heads turned, searching for the speaker. Marcus's smile faltered, confusion crossing his face. Daniel stepped forward from the crowd, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, to stay quiet, like he'd always been. But he thought of his mother, of her strength, of her instruction to be brave. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Marcus asked, his voice sharp with irritation at being interrupted. Daniel walked closer to the stage, close enough that everyone could see him clearly. "I asked if your philosophy of eliminating weakness includes abandoning your pregnant girlfriend 30 years ago, or does that kind of hard decision not make it into the inspirational speeches?" Marcus's face went from confusion to anger in seconds. "Who the hell are you? Security? Remove this person immediately." "My name is Daniel Reed," Daniel said, his voice stronger now, carrying across the silent ballroom. "But you knew my mother as Catherine Reed. You dated her 30 years ago when you were starting your career. When she told you she was pregnant, you gave her $5,000 and told her to take care of it. Then you changed your number and never spoke to her again." The color drained from Marcus's face. Around the ballroom, guests whispered urgently to each other. Journalists' phones came out. Cameras pointed at the stage. Board members exchanged alarmed glances. That's impossible," Marcus stammered, his legendary composure crumbling. "Catherine Reed we dated briefly, but she never told me." "She told you," Daniel interrupted. "You chose not to listen. You chose your career over your child, and my mother chose to raise me alone, working herself to exhaustion to give me opportunities you couldn't be bothered to provide. She died 4 years ago, by the way. Cancer, in case you were wondering what happened to her." Marcus gripped the podium, his knuckles white. "You're making this up. Some kind of scam to—" "I have the paternity test," Daniel said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "I had it done 3 months ago using DNA from a water glass you left on the research floor. It's a 99.8% match. I also have letters she saved from you, photographs, and medical records that confirm the timeline. I'm your son, Marcus, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. The room erupted in chaos. Journalists shouted questions. Board members huddled together in urgent conversation. Clients stared in shock. Jennifer covered her mouth with her hand, tears in her eyes. Richard Chen looked at Daniel with a mixture of sadness and respect. Marcus stood frozen on stage, his carefully constructed image shattering around him. He looked at Daniel, really looked at him for the first time, and saw the resemblance he'd been blind to for months. The same eyes, the same jawline, the same dark hair. His son, standing in front of 500 witnesses, exposing the secret Marcus didn't even know he'd been keeping. "Why?" Marcus finally asked, his voice barely a whisper into the microphone. "Why now? Why like this?" Daniel met his gaze steadily. "Because you spent 3 months mocking me, belittling me, trying to break me the same way you broke my mother 30 years ago. Because you've built your entire empire on stepping on people you think are weak. And because you needed to know that sometimes the people you dismiss as beneath you are the ones who could have given your life meaning if you'd been brave enough to let them." Daniel placed the envelope on a nearby table and turned to leave. But before he reached the door, he stopped and looked back at Marcus one final time. "For what it's worth, I didn't come here for your money or your name. I came because I wanted to understand what kind of man my father was. Now I know, and I feel sorry for you, Marcus, because my mother was poor, and she worked herself to death. But she was happy. She had love and purpose and people who genuinely cared about her. You have none of that. You're surrounded by people who fear you or use you, and you're so busy being cruel that you've forgotten how to be human. That's a poverty no amount of money can fix." With that, Daniel walked out of the Plaza Hotel, out into the cold December night, leaving behind the ruins of Marcus Vanderbilt's carefully crafted image. The following weeks were brutal for Marcus. The story exploded across financial news outlets and social media. Billionaire CEO's secret son revealed at charity gala. Abandoned intern confronts father. Vanderbilt Capital's toxic culture exposed. Several major clients pulled their accounts, uncomfortable with the publicity and the ethical questions raised. 3 board members called for Marcus's resignation. The company's reputation, built over 3 decades, suffered severe damage overnight. Marcus hired lawyers, publicists, and crisis management teams. He issued carefully worded statements expressing surprise and promising to handle the matter privately. But the damage was done. The man who had built his image on strength and decisiveness was now seen as someone who had abandoned his responsibilities and treated his own son with cruelty. Alone in his penthouse one night, surrounded by expensive furniture and impressive views that suddenly felt empty, Marcus opened his laptop and searched for Catherine Reed's obituary. There she was, smiling in a photograph from happier times. The obituary was simple. Catherine Reed, 48, beloved mother and devoted friend, passed away after a courageous battle with cancer. She is survived by her son, Daniel, who was the light of her life. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to scholarship funds for underprivileged students. Marcus stared at those words for a long time. The light of her life. He had a son who had been someone's entire world, and Marcus had missed all of it because of fear and selfishness. He hadn't even known she was sick, hadn't known she died, hadn't known that somewhere in the city, a young man who shared his DNA was working 3 jobs to put himself through college while grieving his mother. For the first time in decades, Marcus Vanderbilt cried. Not performative tears for sympathy, but genuine, wrenching sobs for everything he'd lost, without even knowing it was his to lose. 2 weeks later, Marcus did something he'd never done before. He asked for help, not from lawyers or publicists, but from Richard Chen, the only person in his organization who had shown consistent integrity. "I need to find Daniel," Marcus said quietly, sitting in Richard's office like a supplicant rather than a CEO. "I know he quit. I know he's not returning calls from anyone associated with the company, but I need to speak with him. Not as his boss, as his father." Richard studied Marcus carefully. Why? To offer him money to keep quiet, to threaten him with lawsuits, to apologize, Marcus said, and the words felt foreign in his mouth. To tell him he was right about everything. Richard was silent for a long moment. "He's working at a nonprofit in Brooklyn, financial literacy programs for low-income communities. He's using his talent to help people his mother would have been proud to help. I'll give you the address, Marcus. But if you hurt that kid again, I'll personally make sure every client we have knows what kind of man you really are." Marcus nodded, accepting the rebuke without argument. The nonprofit was housed in a converted warehouse in Sunset Park, nothing like the gleaming towers of Manhattan. Inside, Young people from the neighborhood gathered for free workshops on budgeting, investing, and financial planning. Daniel stood at the front of a classroom, teaching a group of teenagers about compound interest and retirement savings, his voice steady and clear in a way it had never been at Vanderbilt Capital. Marcus stood in the doorway, watching. This was his son, not trying to impress wealthy clients or survive in a toxic corporate environment, but genuinely trying to make a difference in people's lives. He was doing exactly what Catherine's obituary had honored, shining light. When the class ended and the students filed out, chattering about what they'd learned, Daniel finally noticed Marcus standing there. His expression didn't change. He simply waited. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Marcus began, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't expect anything from you, but I needed you to know that you were right about all of it. I spent 30 years building something that looks impressive from the outside but means nothing. I hurt people, including you, because I thought cruelty was strength. I was wrong." Daniel leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "Why are you here, Marcus? Not Dad, not Father, just Marcus." And somehow, that hurt more than any insult could have. "I'm here because I'm trying to figure out how to be someone better than the man you described at that gala. I know I can't undo the past, can't bring your mother back or give you the childhood you deserved. But maybe I can try to be someone who deserves to be called your father, even if it takes the rest of my life." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "My mother told me to be better than you. She told me not to let your cowardice define me. For a long time I thought that meant proving I was smarter, more successful, more worthy. But now I realize it meant something else. It meant choosing compassion over cruelty, connection over isolation, being someone people genuinely love, not just fear or tolerate." "She sounds like she was extraordinary," Marcus said softly. "She was. And you missed knowing her because you were too scared to be inconvenienced by a child." Daniel's voice was firm but not angry. "I'm not going to pretend we're suddenly family because you had an epiphany. I don't need your money or your connections or your guilt. But if you genuinely want to change, to be someone different, then maybe someday we can have a conversation that doesn't involve lawyers or press releases. Maybe." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was a door left slightly ajar, and Marcus understood that was more than he deserved. "Thank you," Marcus said, "for even that much. And Daniel, your mother was right about you. You're better than I ever was." Marcus left the nonprofit, stepping out into the cold Brooklyn evening. The city stretched out around him, millions of people living lives he'd never bothered to understand because he'd been too busy believing he was above them. He didn't know if he could truly change. Habits and cruelty were deeply ingrained after 5 decades. But for the first time in his life, Marcus Vanderbilt wanted to try. Not for his reputation or his business, but because somewhere in this city, his son was teaching teenagers about compound interest and honoring the memory of a woman who had loved, despite having every reason not to. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth more than all the wealth he'd spent a lifetime accumulating. 6 months later, Marcus stepped down as CEO of Vanderbilt Capital. He remained as a consultant, but handed daily operations to Richard Chen, who immediately implemented policies against harassment and created mentorship programs for employees from underprivileged backgrounds. Marcus sold his penthouse and moved into a smaller apartment, donating millions to scholarship funds in Catherine Reed's name. And once a month, on Sunday afternoons, Marcus volunteered at the nonprofit in Brooklyn. He taught workshops on investment strategy, sitting beside his son, learning slowly in pain.